I want to come back on the three towers that Herod built, Hippicus, Phasealus and Mariamne. Josephus is telling us a lot about them. Unfortunately, he fails to tell us where they were located. Now, in video number 13, my contention was that Josephus' description of the walls of Jerusalem leaves us with two options. Namely, the one that Hippicus is over here, Hippicus being over here, with Mariamne and Phasealus in his slipstream over here, or that Hippicus is over here on that side of the city, on the east side of the city, and the issue is that when it's over here on the east side, that this must be Antonia. That isn't true for the other option. For the other option, it is still possible that Antonia is either here or Antonia is here. But in the other alternative, the Temple Mount is not a Temple Mount, but Fortress Antonia. Now, I already indicated that, in my opinion, it's more likely that Hippicus is over here. In that case, it doesn't add anything to the case about the temple location being here or here. But although the likelihood is probably remote that Hippicus is over here, based on the description of Josephus, I still want to discuss the arguments, those in favor and those against, because there might be proof out there for the location of some of the mentioned monuments and other location identifiers mentioned by Josephus in his description of the walls, and those are related to the position of Hippicus. You see here the Fuller monument, the King's Graves, Helena's monument, for instance, and the Essene Gate and Gennet Gate and the Women's Tower. If we change the position of Hippicus from here to there, you see that those monuments are changing as well. So, and if those proofs are out there, other documents or excavations or that positively identify one of those objects by their name, bijvoorbeeld the Fuller monument, then that might settle the matter for the location of Hippicus. And okay, I do have another personal interest as well. The fact that I became interested in the topology of Jerusalem during the years prior to its destruction is for a reason that I'm about to write a novel. And for this, I want to be aware of the context in which the story takes place for matters of space and time. Anyway, what are the facts, the hints, the arguments on these three towers? Now, there are three things which more or less are fixed. And that is one, they were all three built by Herod the Great. Josephus tells us that multiple times their names were associated with Herod. Hippicus is a friend of Herod, Phasealus is a brother of Herod, and Mariamne is a wife of Herod. So I take it for a fact that those three towers were built by Herod the Great. And two, those three towers are geographically connected and associated with a fortress, a palace, and an elevated site. These associations are also consistently told by Josephus multiple times and therefore also taken as a fact by me. Now, and number three, there are only two plausible sites which contains a palace, and both are on an elevated position and both can be described as a fortress. So based on these associations, either Fortress Antonia or the palace of Herod himself came into picture. And that feels okay, because those were the two of the greatest building projects by Herod in Jerusalem. And for both of these constructions, big towers are easy to imagine. So this I have taken as a fact as well. Those three towers were either part of Antonia or part of the palace of King Herod. Therefore, it must be easy to screen the events in Josephus' narrative in which these towers or Herod's palace or Antonia plays a role in order to see what fits best. Now, the best quote to start with, which immediately illustrates the difficulty of it, is the description of Fortress Antonia. Now, we have read that before, and I'm not going to tell you all of it, but this is an interesting phrase. And as the entire structure resembled that of a tower, he's talking about Antonia, it contains also 4 other distinct towers at its 4 corners, whereof the other were but 50 cubits high, whereas that which lay upon the southeast corner was 70 cubits high. And from thence the whole temple might be viewed. Now, it sounds logical that when Herod extended the citadel of the Hasmoneans, and in fact making a rectangle bigger, that you by doing so create 3 vacancies for a tower. So the number of 3 vacancies seems to fit. The strange thing is that those names are not mentioned in this context, and that is a little bit strange because Josephus loves to talk about those towers, and now he remains silent. Now, the second quote is where Josephus describes the towers in detail. That is from the same book, Jewish Wars, book number 5, chapter 4, paragraph 3, and I'm not going to read that either. You can do that for yourself. But the summary is that Hippicus is over against Phasealus. Unfortunately, that doesn't tell us much either, because Phasealus is for certain somewhere here, and you can describe Hippicus being over against Phasealus on this location, because then you are looking from the west, and you see this tower, and you see this tower, and a piece of wall in between, or you are standing on the top of Mount Scopus just north of Jerusalem, and you are looking at Jerusalem, and you see on your right side Phasealus, and on your left side you see Hippicus, if this is the scenario with Hippicus over here. So that doesn't distinguish between those two. Now, what he also mentioned in this quote is that Simon exercised his tyrannical authority from Phasealus, and that doesn't give you a clue either, because Simon, as you might remember, was in charge of most of Jerusalem except for the temple and the lower city. So Herod's palace as well as Antonia were under the control of Simon. So that doesn't tell us also not much. Now, the towers seem to differ in height from the towers described with Antonia, but that doesn't say that much either, because it is unclear in the description whether or not Josephus includes the height of the construction upon which those towers were built. But he describes Phasealus to be 20 cubits higher than the other ones, which nicely aligns with the description of Antonia, that also had one tower 20 cubits higher. Now, the third quote is from the same chapter, but slightly more down the line, paragraph 4. And there it's being said that those towers were built on the old wall. And that doesn't seem to work in case of Antonia, because Antonia was extended by Herod, and most of the walls of Antonia were therefore brand new. So that seems to suggest more in the direction of Herod's palace instead of Antonia. Moreover, he describes a palace between those towers as being extremely beautiful and elegant, which fits more the palace of Herod the Great than the relatively modest and much older palace of the Hasmonean, which has to be on Antonia. Now, the last alinea of this paragraph seems to suggest a connection with the Tower of Antonia, and that of course hints more in the direction of the fortress instead of the palace. But on the other hand, it is being mentioned here that those towers were being burned down by the robbers, and that it was done by the robbers and not by the Romans. And that is described in the Jewish War, number 17, paragraph 8, which we are going to address now. But that suggests that it was with the palace of Herod, because the rebels burned down the palace of Herod. It is an interesting quote because it describes Roman soldiers abandoning their camps because the defense of the fortress was breached, and then the Romans start running at the towers, Hippicus, Phasealus and Mariamne, suggesting that these towers were around the camp. Now the question is then, where were those soldiers at that moment? Were they in Antonia or in Herod's palace? And I can tell you, if you read the paragraph yourself, then it describes all kinds of very turbulent events preceding this flight towards those towers. And there's a lot of fog of war, so to speak. But I would say that they were in Fortress Antonia. All in all, this description favors the descriptions up until now, favor slightly the palace of King Herod. And then we got a quote which favors clearly the Antonia option for these towers. And that is a story that took place at least 60 years prior to the destruction of the temple. Well, maybe 70 years even, when a Roman commander was in charge of Jerusalem, and it was not a hero apparently, and he himself flew to the tower. For Sabinus himself, he got up to the highest tower of the fortress, which was called Phasealus. And then he made signs to the soldiers of that legion to attack the enemy. For his astonishment was so great that he durst not to go down to his own men. Going down to his own men. Hereupon the soldiers were prevailed upon and leaped out into the temple. Now what this describes is a situation that the Roman commander was in the tower of Phasealus and was directing his soldiers in Antonia to jump into the temple in order to fight over there. Now that doesn't make much sense in this configuration, because this is 900 meters and it sounds a little bit too far to command your soldiers. And he dared not to come down to his soldiers, suggesting that his soldiers were over here. But then the word that they jumped down, that they leaped down into the temple, is a little bit strange as well. So it clearly suggested that this guy was on the top in Fortress Antonia, on top of one of the towers in Antonia, the highest one, on the southeast corner of Fortress Antonia, and was directing his soldiers in Antonia to fight into the temple. And that does work for both scenarios. It also works for this scenario, that he was standing here and directing his soldiers here to jump into the temple. So this clearly favors the Antonia option for these towers. I would say that based on all these quotes that we have seen so far, the needle is slightly leaning towards Antonia as the location for the three towers. But then came this quote, and it's almost the final one, and that is when Titus had captured the last part of Jerusalem, the upper city, and went into it to inspect the upper city. And then the following is being revealed. Now, when Titus was come into this upper city, he admired not only some other places and of strength in it, but particularly those strong towers which the tyrants in their mad conduct had relinquished. For when he saw their solid attitude and the largeness of the several stones and the exactness of their joints, as also how great was their breadth and how extensive their length, he expressed himself. Now, and then follows, and what he decided. Let me see. At which time, let me see, to conduct the entire. To conclude, when he entirely demolished the rest of the city and overthrew its walls, he left these towers as a monument of good fortune. So Titus came into the upper city, saw those three towers, and he decided to demolish everything except for these three towers. Now, well, you might say their names are not mentioned, so it might be three other towers, but that doesn't work, because in the following and very last quote, and that is in book number 7, chapter 1, paragraph 1, it becomes clear that Caesar gave orders that they should demolish the entire city, the temple, but should leave as many of the towers standing as were of greatest eminency, that is, Phasealus, Hippicus, and Mariamne. So it clearly gets the needle firmly towards King Herod's palace, because those three towers seems to be in the upper city, and the palace of Herod is clearly situated in the upper city. Now, if that's the case, it doesn't affect the other arguments in our quest to show that it is the Temple Mount, that this is not the Temple Mount, but Fortress Antonia. We just can't use this argument when Hippicus turned out to be here, because when Hippicus appeared to be there, then both scenarios are still possible, with Antonia here and the temple here, or the alternative, Antonia here and the temple over there. Now, I'm not suggesting that the matter is settled, not at all. The fog of war and the fog of history always gives some wiggle room to believe something else, if the needle is still not flat on one side. And the needle is not flat on one side, it's just leaning towards this scenario. Anyway, I hope you have an idea how you have to connect all kind of dots in order to get a picture of the layout of Jerusalem, but I can tell you, with regards to the location of the temple, it's way more easy, as I have explained in a whole series of videos. But again, I'm still interested in proof that might be out there on the locations of the monuments and the other location indicators that independent from Josephus, because that might move the needle. Thank you for listening.